Neshama shir chadash Okay, everybody, good to see you. Thank you for coming. And our dedications are the normal dedications, praying for the victory of our chayolim in all the fronts of the war. Obviously, as you know, new fronts are being opened up, so we're not out of the water yet. For the lasting unity of the people of Israel and for all of those whose health has been affected by the war, the safe return of all of the hostages, Aliyat Neshama, Gitel bat Moshe HaCohen, whose yard site was on Omer, and for Rachel Foyer, Rachel bat Alter Chaim Binyamin. And as well as an anonymous contribution was made for the nitzachon of all of our chayolim and all of our hostages to return safe, totally healthy to their homes, refuas and nefesh, refuas aguf, Hashem's protection to Klal Yisrael for the Gula Shlema in these days. Just as a little bit of biographical information, we read a person whose yard site was Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer was also the yard site of the Ramah, the great Ashkenazi posek, the Rav of Krakow. And it is said when the Ramah was nifter at a young age, it's meshunit. As I get older and I look at the age of some of the greatest gedolim, it makes me realize how meager our accomplishments might be. But the Ramah died, I think, at 48, before the age of 50, for sure. And somebody wanted to give a hesped, since he died in Lag BaOmer, he wanted to enumerate the 33 praises of the Ramah. I think he only got to 32. He couldn't think of a 33rd one. So the hesped is a little incomplete. If you look at the hespedim that were given at the Ramah's levaya, someone enumerates 32 milas of the Ramah. He somehow, I don't know, it seems to me a creative machadish could somehow divide two things into, one thing into two things, but it's only 32 shabachos. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is actually a continuation of last week. Last week was the mitzvah of counting of the Omer. We are still in the counting of the Omer. So I want to talk about the counting of the Omer, the idea of counting the days between Pesach and Shavuos. I just want to mention, as a matter of interesting halacha, that there's actually three opinions among the commentators if the mitzvah is da'oraisa today or not. Most Rishonim, Tosos and Menachos, and most Rishonim actually say that the mitzvah to count the Omer bisman hazeh today, when there's no temple, is only a rabbinic law to commemorate what was done when there was a temple, because the Torah says you start counting the Sfira from the day you bring the Omer offering, which is the second day of Pesach. We don't have an Omer offering, so according to most opinions, the counting of the Omer today is Rabbanan, Zecher, to remember what was done when there was a Beis HaMikdash. The one opinion who takes a stricter view is the opinion of the Rambam. The Rambam actually says that the mitzvah of counting the Omer period is independent of bringing the Korban HaOmer. So even when there's no Beis HaMikdash and we don't bring the Korban HaOmer, we are still mechuyev to count min HaTorah. So this is a machlokus generally. Is Sevira today a Torah commandment, which is the Rambam's opinion, or is Sevira today a rabbinic commandment, Zecher LeMikdash? Now you might ask me, well, ultimately, what's the difference? You got to do it. Even a rabbinic commandment has to be done. So there actually is a bit of a difference whether you could fulfill the mitzvah of Sevira in the twilight zone between sunset and the stars coming up. Because according to halacha, the twilight zone is a safek if it belongs to the preceding day or it's already the new day. Now, normally when it comes to rabbinic laws, we are permitted to err on the side of leniency. When it comes to Torah laws, we have to be strict. Now, in America in particular, it's very, very common that Mariv is davened before the stars are out. In other words, it's not yet dark. They daven after sunset and before the stars coming out. So as a result, are you allowed to count the Omer that early? According to Tosos and Menachos, you could, because even though that period is a safek, if it's day or night, on a rabbinic commandment, you can give yourself the benefit that it's night. Masha'en Ken, according to the Rambam, that counting the Omer is d'oraisa, you would not be allowed to count the Omer till for sure it's night, and therefore you'd have to wait until the stars come out. And since we have this machlokas, that's why we encourage people, if they're davening Mariv early, to say Sfira when it's dark, in order to be Yotzei the Rambam's opinion. Now, those are the two basic opinions, that Sfira is either Drabanan or Sfira is d'oraisa. But there's a third opinion that's very enigmatic. And this third opinion was by one of the great Rishonim, who's extremely important in the history of halacha, although he's not so well known. This is Rabbeinu Yerucham. Rabbeinu Yerucham was a disciple of the Rosh, and although in our yeshiva curriculum we typically don't mention Rabbeinu Yerucham, but if you learn halacha and not just Gemara, you will see Rabbeinu Yerucham is extraordinarily important. In the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbeinu Yerucham is constantly mentioned and constantly quoted. And Rabbeinu Yerucham says a very strange thing that it's hard to figure out. He says, part of the counting of the Omer is a Torah law, and part of the counting of the Omer is only a rabbinic law. We know when we count the Omer, we count both days and weeks. So, for example, when it's the 7th day of the Omer or the 14th day of the Omer, we say, this is the 14th day of the Omer, or the 14th day, which is 2 weeks of the Omer. And it has to be done that way, because there's a mitzvah to count days, and there's a mitzvah to count weeks. So says Rabbeinu Yerucham the following idea. The mitzvah to count days is a Torah commandment, even when there's no Beis HaMikdash. But the mitzvah to count weeks is obligatory under Torah law only when there's a Beis HaMikdash, and when there's no Beis HaMikdash, the counting of weeks is only Zecher LaMikdash. This is Rabbeinu Yerucham's opinion. Now, he doesn't really give you any explanation for it, and it's very difficult to understand. I can understand the general debate. Does the mitzvah of Sfira depend on the Korban, or is it independent of the Korban? So if it depends on the Korban, then everything is rabbinic today. If it doesn't depend on the Korban, everything is Torah today. So the Rambam says it's not dependent on the Korban, so everything is Torah. And Tosfos says it is dependent on the Korban, so everything is rabbinic. Okay, we got that. But where are you going to get any type of logic to say, the days are independent, and therefore they're Torah laws. The weeks are dependent, and therefore it's only rabbinic today. What's the logic to differentiate between the days and the weeks? So the Or Sameach, Rav Meir Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk, the great Gadol, the Rav of Dvinsk, offers a very, very nice explanation for Rabbeinu Yerucham's somewhat enigmatic opinion. And he says the following. Shavuos, the holiday of Shavuos, is both a 1-day Chag, and on some level it is a 7-day Chag. I'm not referring to the Golot of 2 days, that's a separate thing. But in Eretz Yisrael, there's a 1-day aspect of Shavuos, and there's a 7-day, strangely enough, aspect of Shavuos. The 1-day aspect of Shavuos is, of course, the Yom Tov. The Yom Tov of Shavuos is only 1 day. What is the 7-day aspect? We know that on each of the Shalosh Regalim, each of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, every male, this was a chiyuv on the male, had to make a pilgrimage to Yerushalayim, and had to physically appear in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, the Azara, and bring a sacrifice. And this was a burnt offering, and this is called an Olas Re'iyah, the burnt offering that is brought when you are seen by God. That's the way it's described. They come to the Azara, the courtyard of the temple, to be seen by God. And I'm not allowed to come empty-handed. I got to come with my korban. Now, the halacha is the following. If you didn't bring your Olat Re'iyah, let's take Pesach for a moment. If you didn't bring your Olat Re'iyah the first day of Pesach, you have 6 more days to bring it. You don't bring it on Shabbos, but other than Shabbos, you can bring it for a total of 7 days. 7 days minus Shabbos. Sukkot, you actually have 1 extra day. You actually have the 7 days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret. Shmini Atzeret itself does not have its own pilgrimage offering, but you can use it as a makeup for the Sukkot pilgrimage offering. So for Pesach, you have 7 days to bring your Olas Re'iyah, again, excluding Shabbos. For Sukkos, you have 8 days for your Olas Re'iyah. What about Shavuos? You might have thought logically, well, you only have 1 day, because after 1 day, it's no longer the Chag. But the Gemara says that we compare, since the Torah juxtaposes the holidays together, we compare Shavuos to Pesach. Just like Pesach, you get 7 days. Shavuos, you get 7 days. The Gemara asks the obvious question, why do you compare Shavuos to Pesach? Maybe compare Shavuos to Sukkot, and you'll have 8 days. So the Gemara uses the famous aphorism, Tafasta meruba le tafasta. If you try to grab onto too much, you'll get nothing at all. Because here's the point. If I compare it to Pesach, I get 7 days. If I compare it to Sukkot, I get 8 days. So either way, I get 7 days. I'm just not sure if I get the extra day. So I got to go with what I'm certain. And I'm certain I have 7 days. So it actually turns out that Shavuos is a holiday on some level for 7 days, because you have the opportunity to bring the Olat Re'iyah. Now, even today, where we don't have the temple, there is a little bit of a zecher to the 7-day aspect of Shavuos, particularly in Eretz Yisrael, where you may notice, you may remember, and you'll see it this year, that the minhag in Yerushalayim, at least, is we don't say Tachanun for 6 days following Shavuos, meaning on Yom Tov we don't say Tachanun, but we don't say it for another 6 days. Why? Because it has a status of somewhat of a festive time, because this was the time of the Olat Re'iyah. Now, says the Meshech Chachma, the reason why the Omer has to be counted in both days and weeks is because since the Omer is a countdown to the holiday of Shavuos, you have to do your counting based on the units of the holiday towards which you're counting. So I count days because Shavuos is a 1-day holiday. I count weeks because Shavuos is a week-long holiday, meaning the units of counting correspond to the Yom Tov. So Rabbeinu Yerucham's logic now becomes very, very clear. The 1 week aspect of Shavuos only existed when there was a Beis HaMikdash, when you had 1 week for the Olas Re'iyah. So as a result, the chiyuv to count weeks lapses when you don't have a Beis HaMikdash, and we only do that today because of a rabbinic law to remember the Mikdash. Masha Enkein, the 1-day aspect of Shavuos still exists today because we have a Chag, and that is why the counting of the Omer is Doraisa when it comes to the days. Again, it's a very, very brilliant, beautiful explanation for Rabbeinu Yerucham's opinion. It also explains an interesting peculiarity of the nusach that many Sfardim have for the Omer. Let me contrast it with Ashkenazim and Sfardim. Let's say, I want to be sure I don't count tonight's series, so last night was, what time? Last night was 37. Okay, so when we counted last night, 37, so the way we said it was, Hayom Shiva Shloshim Yom, this is the 37th day, Shehem Chamisha Shavuos Ushnei Yamim, which is 5 weeks and 2 days. And we then end it with either Ba Omer, La Omer, that's another machlokas, but in other words, we put the word Omer at the end of the sentence. That is the standard Nusach Ashkenaz. Sfardim, or many Sfardim, not all, they say it a little differently. They say, Hayom, I'm using last night's Omer count, Hayom Shiva Shloshim Yom Ba'Omer. This is the 37th day of the Omer, which is 5 weeks and 2 days. In other words, they move the word Omer, instead of being at the end of the phrase, they position it after the Yamim. Why would that be so? Again, there's no particular reason why that would be so. So, Lani Astati, this is my own speculation, that the basis of this nusach is Rabbeinu Yerucham, that the days are a Torah requirement, and the weeks are only a rabbinic requirement. So we want to position the word Omer adjacent to the Torah count and not to the rabbinic count. And that's why we say this is the 37th day of the Omer, because that's the Torah mitzvah. And then we add on the rabbinic edition, which is 5 weeks and 2 days. Okay, so that's a little bit of technical halakha I just wanted to share with you. But now I want to focus on another issue, which was a machlokas that existed for hundreds and hundreds of years in the time of the Second Temple, and it still exists today with the Karaites. When the Torah gives us the mitzvah of counting the Omer, the Torah says, you shall count mimacharas, the day after Shabbos. Start counting the day after Shabbos. Mimacharas HaShabbos. Now, in the time of the Second Temple, there were two movements in Judaism. One movement are the Prushim, the Pharisees, which the Christian Bible treats very poorly, but it happens to be the Pharisees are what we call Chazal, the Prushim, right? There are people. But then there was a movement that was quite large and powerful, politically well-connected and wealthy, called the Tzdukim, the Sadducees. Tzdukim is simply because the name of the founder of the movement was a person, Tzadok, that happened to be his name. And the Sadducees essentially did not accept the authority of the oral law, and they interpreted the Torah in a very literalistic manner. Now, the Sadducees as a movement became more or less extinct during the Churban of the Second Temple, meaning essentially no Tzdukim, or at least a movement of Tzdukim, did not survive. So the Tzdukim as a movement were kaput. However, much, much later, in the 10th century, in the 900s, after the Talmud, in the time of Rav Saadia Gaon, a movement that is somewhat similar to the Sadducees was reinvented, and these are called the Karaim, the Karaites. And Karaites too, today they're a very insignificant movement. There are Karaites here in Israel, they have a synagogue, etc. They're very small, but in Rav Saadia Gaon's time, in the Rambam's time, Karaites were very, very big, and they posed a major, major threat to Halakhic Judaism. And again, so the Karaites, or the Karaim, and the Tzdukim are not the same people. They are not the same movement. They originated at different times, but they do represent the same philosophy of kind of literalism, as it were. And they take the position that if the Torah says you start counting the Omer the day after Shabbos, Shabbos means Saturday, and therefore the counting of the Omer will always start on the first Sunday after Pesach. Now actually, this year, it happens to be that we're doing the same thing as the Karaites, because we started, so this year is a year, I guess, of Achdus, of Shalom, Halvai, in which we're together with the Karaites. But normally the Karaites would defer the counting of the Omer till Sunday, till Saturday night, Sunday, after Pesach. Because the Karaites have the same belief, but in the Gemara, it discusses the Tzdukim. So the Tzdukim interpreted Shabbos to be literal. Saturday, Shabbos. Chazal, our sages, have a tradition that the word Shabbos in that pasuk does not mean Saturday, but it's a reference to the Yom Tov of Pesach that is called Shabbos. And Mimacharas HaShabbos is the day after the Yom Tov of Pesach, i.e. second day of Pesach. And this was a controversy that lasted really for hundreds and hundreds of years. And if you learn the Mishnah, you learn the Gemara, you actually see that the sages went to very, very great lengths to uproot and dispute this belief. Apparently this belief was widely accepted. Part of why it was widely accepted is it created a convenience for vacation days. Because if you start counting the Omer on Saturday night, Sunday, so Shavuos is going to be Shabbos Sunday. Will be Sunday. So you have Shabbos and Sunday is a 2-day vacation, meaning normally Shavuos is only a 1-day vacation. When you start counting the Omer Motzei Shabbos, you get a 2-day vacation. So the Sadducee position was very popular among the working classes, but nevertheless the sages went to very great lengths. So the question I want to start discussing is, of course, we believe what Chazal say. Chazal tell us that the word Shabbos in that pasuk is referring to the Yom Tov of Pesach. But why did the Torah use a word that is potentially so ambiguous? Why did it use a word whose simple meaning is Shabbos? And then we interpret it doesn't mean Shabbos, it means Yom Tov. So here too I want to share with you a thought of the Meshech Chochmah. Very, very interesting thought. He points out, let's look through the prism of halacha for a moment, at the major difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Right? We have Shabbos, we have Yom Tov. Both Shabbos and Yom Tov, you're not allowed to engage in malacha. But what's the difference? So there are two fundamental differences between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Difference number one is what we call ochel nefesh, food preparation. Shabbos, the malachos of Shabbos are absolute. You're not allowed to desecrate Shabbos for food preparation. I mean, that's obvious. One of the 39 malachos of Shabbos is called cooking. So unless it's pikuach nefesh, which is a matter of life and death, Shabbos, there is no heter to do malacha for food preparation. Masha ein kein Yom Tov, without getting into all the details of Hilchos Yom Tov, even though you're not allowed to do malacha, but you're allowed to do it for food preparation and other types of Yom Tov needs. You're allowed to cook. You're allowed to carry if that becomes necessary. So we'll call this, as the Torah calls it, the heter, the dispensation of ochel nefesh, of food that sustains the soul, is permitted on Yom Tov. It is not permitted on Shabbos. That is difference number one. Difference number two is the source of the holiness of Shabbos and Yom Tov. Shabbos was sanctified by God. And as a result, Shabbos is Shabbos, whether I know it's Shabbos or I don't know it's Shabbos. Shabbos is Shabbos, even if God forbid, there would not be a single Jew in the world, which will never happen, but if there would not be a single Jew in the world who knew that today was Shabbos, it would still be Shabbos. Shabbos is sanctified by God. And even though we engage in a ritual called Kiddush, that does not mean we are sanctifying the Shabbos. We are just acknowledging that this is the day that was sanctified by God. Yom Tov is actually a very, very different type of Kedusha. Yom Tov very much depends on X number of days from the sanctification of the new moon. Pesach, for example, is the 15th day from the sanctification of the month of Nisan. Rosh Hashanah happens to be the first day of the sanctification of the month. And the Gemara tells us that if the Sanhedrin proclaimed the wrong day as Rosh Chodesh, because they were fooled, the Yom Tov is not counted astronomically from the actual appearance of the new moon. It is counted from the day that the Sanhedrin sanctified the Rosh Chodesh. If you remember, there's actually a story in the Mishnah where Rabbi Yehoshua disagreed with the calculations of the Sanhedrin about Rosh Hashanah, and his Yom Kippur, he thought Rosh Hashanah was a day later, and his Yom Kippur would be a day later. Rabbi Gamliel ordered him, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, ordered him to come to him with his staff and his money on Rabbi Yeshua's Yom Kippur. And Rabbi Yeshua didn't know what to do. How could I desecrate the holy day of Yom Kippur? And Rabbi Akiva told him, even when they're wrong, the holidays are based on that establishment. Now, you might ask the question, well, if that's the case, how do Yomim Tovim work today? Today we don't have a Sanhedrin that is taking witnesses about a new moon. We're working off a calendar. Why is there Yom Tov at all today? So you know what the Ramban says? The Ramban says very fascinatingly that towards the end of the Sanhedrin's tenure, around the 400s, the Chachamim knew that the Sanhedrin would be disbanded soon. So they created the Jewish calendar. They calculated all of the Rosh Chodeshes till the year 6000, because we know that Mashiach will be there by then and we'll go back to the old system. And they actually verbally proclaimed all these Rosh Chodeshim events. I mean, imagine a book of 200 pages, and it just gives you the dates of every Rosh Chodesh from the year 450 Common Era to the year 6000. So that's 5,600 times 12, numbers of 5,600 years times 12, all of those things. And they would just read. They would say, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, this, Rosh Chodesh Iyar, this, and in other words, the Ramban actually says that every Chag that we have is only because the Sanhedrin sanctified the new moons ahead of time. And that is the meaning of the statement that is often stated, the Jewish calendar expires in the year 6000. Now, from a mathematical standpoint, that's a nonsensical statement because the Jewish calendar is based on calculations. So the truth of the matter is, what do you mean it expires? If you were to ask me, what day will Rosh Chodesh Nisan fall out based on the calendar 10,000 years from now? Not that I know the answer, but I would be able to figure it out. It doesn't expire. It's a process that can be extrapolated indefinitely. So what does it mean the calendar expires in the year 6000? It means that their book that they read from, this is Rosh Chodesh, stopped at the year 6000. Therefore, if counterfactually, Mashiach would not come by the year 6000, there would be no obligation to keep Yomim Tovim, because there would not be the sanctification of Beis Din. Shabbos we'd have to keep, not Yom Tov. In other words, the holiness of Yom Tov depends on Am Yisrael. The holiness of Shabbos is independent from Am Yisrael. And this is reflected in the differential bracha. When it comes to Shabbos, we say, Baruch atah Hashem mikadesh haShabbos. Blessed art you, God, who sanctified the Shabbos. When it comes to Yom Tov, very exact. We say, Mikadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. You sanctify Am Yisrael, who is then given the capacity to sanctify the times by Kiddush HaChodesh, by proclaiming Rosh Chodesh. We have that control. Now, here is the thing. That's why when it's Shabbos and Yom Tov, you have to know how exact the liturgy is. When it's both Shabbos and Yom Tov, the way the bracha is, Baruch atah Hashem, Mikadesh HaShabbos, V'Yisrael, V'Hazmanim. You don't say, Mikadesh Yisrael, V'HaShabbos, V'Hazmanim. No. Mikadesh HaShabbos. You sanctify Shabbos. You then sanctify Am Yisrael, who has the power to sanctify the Yom Tov through the process of Kiddush HaChodesh. So, B'kitzer, so far, there are two major distinctions between Shabbos and Yom Tov. One is the heter for food preparation, and the other is the sanctification of Shabbos comes from God. The sanctification of Yom Tov comes from Am Yisrael acting through their Sanhedrin as they sanctify the new moon. And even today, it's based on that because the last Sanhedrins sanctified the new moons in advance based on the cheshbonots that were created at that time. Now, says Rav Meir Simcha in the Meshech Chochmah, these two distinctions between Shabbos and Yom Tov depend on a third distinction. And this third distinction will explain the other two. And that is, Yom Tov gets created only because of the unique relationship that God has with the Jewish people. There wouldn't be a Pesach if there wouldn't have been a Yetzias Mitzrayim. There wouldn't have been a Shavuos if there wouldn't have been a Matan Torah. There wouldn't have been a Sukkos had there not been the clouds of glory that surrounded us. Yom Tov exists only because of us. Yom Tov exists only because of God's relationship to us, as opposed to Shabbos. Shabbos commemorates something, although only Jews keep Shabbos, that's very true. But Shabbos commemorates something that in a sense is independent of the existence of the Jewish people. Shabbos commemorates the fact that Hashem made the world in 6 days and rested. So says the Meshech Chochmah, Since Yom Tov comes into existence only because of us, it bends to our needs. We have food preparation needs. Yom Tov bends to us. Yom Tov is batel to us. And we are given the koach to sanctify this man. Because Yom Tov comes from us. And by the way, that's why the halakha is very clear that the heter to cook on Yom Tov is only for a Jew, not for a non-Jew. You're not allowed to cook for a non-Jew on Yom Tov. In fact, according to the Gemara, you're not even supposed to invite a non-Jew. Okay, that's a separate shayla. We have some that we look for heterim for that. We have intermarried couples and the like, but that only goes to the invitation aspect, which is a rabbinic extension. The actual cooking for a non-Jew on Yom Tov, for sure, that is absolutely usher. Now, since Shabbos does not depend on us, it does not yield to us, it does not bend to our needs, nor do we control the holiness of Shabbos. So you see so far the structure, a very nice structure. We start with two halakhic differences between Shabbos and Yom Tov. One is ochel nefesh, food preparation, and the other is who establishes the holiness. And those two halakhic differences are based on the third idea that Yom Tov comes into existence only because of us. And that's why we kind of control Yom Tov in ways that we don't control Shabbos, because Shabbos has nothing to do with us. And that's why it's called a gift, by the way. Shabbos is called a precious gift that God gave us. What is the nature of a gift? Something that you get out of the blue. You didn't earn it, you don't deserve it, you get a gift. Right? Shabbos is a gift. Okay. So now it says the Meshech Chochmah. Although it's true that the Chagim arise out of Hashem's unique relationship to Am Yisrael, but of all of the Yomim Tovim, Pesach is the most like Shabbos. Because if Shabbos represents a gift that we didn't earn and we didn't deserve, and it doesn't emanate from our relationship with God, Pesach is somewhat similar, because remember that Pesach represented a redemption that we didn't earn. We should have been in Mitzrayim 400 years. Hashem had to redeem us after 210 years because we would have hit level 50 and we would have disappeared. And indeed, as it was, 4/5 of the Jewish people, in fact, disappeared. So it was a redemption we weren't ready for. It was a redemption we didn't earn. It was a redemption that was given to us as a matana. So that's why it's called Shabbos. It's called Shabbos because it is the most Shabbos-like, unlike Shavuos, which we earned by counting of the Omer, by preparing ourselves, by purifying ourselves. Unlike Sukkot, which is the aftermath of Yom Kippur and the tshuva process for the sin of the golden calf. Pesach was a gift, was a freebie. And because it was a freebie, it partakes of the nature of Shabbos. I would like to add to the Meshech, I don't think he says this, that this might explain an interesting thing. If I were to ask you, where does the Torah tell me you're allowed to cook, you're allowed to do food preparation on Yom Tov? Like, where is this law of Ochel Nefesh? The answer is, it is in Parshas Bo, dealing with Pesach, meaning the Torah doesn't mention Ochel Nefesh for Pesach or Shavuos. It mentions it for Shavuos and Sukkot. It mentions it only for Pesach. And we learn out the other holidays from Pesach. Why does it mention it for Pesach? Because here's the thing. Pesach might bedafka be the one Yom Tov where you would think you don't have a heter of Ochel Nefesh because it's not something that we earned and therefore it's not something we would control. So the Torah had to tell me even Pesach has the status of a Yom Tov and Kal V'chomer the other Yomim Tovim. That might be, I think, a good explanation for this. Okay. So this is the Meshech Chochmah's beautiful explanation why Pesach is referred to as Shabbos. But now I want to take this one step further. The Sefer HaChinuch writes, and this is a very well-known theme, that and we said this more than once, the purpose of counting of the Omer is to connect the holiday of freedom with the holiday of Torah, to make it one long holiday, in order to underscore the idea that freedom is worthwhile only when it's linked to submission to Hashem. Meaning, don't celebrate freedom as a separate value. Freedom is worthwhile when it connects to serving God. And that's why Chazal say the grain offering of Pesach was barley. Omer is barley, which is animal fodder. The grain offering of Shavuos is wheat, which is human consumption. Because when you go from Pesach to Shavuos, you're actually going from animal to human. So here's the question. If that is so, and this is an idea that is universally stated, that the counting of the Omer links freedom and submission to God, why don't we start counting the Omer from day one? We ought to start counting the Omer from the first day of Pesach. Why do it from day 2? Why is it Mimocharas HaPesach? So the Sefer HaChinuch himself asks the question, and the Sefer HaChinuch says, well, listen, on the day that we celebrate the Exodus, we don't want to bring in other holidays. We want to just focus 100%. This is a klal. Ein ma'arvin simcha b'simcha. We don't try to mix one joy with another joy. We want to focus totally. But the emes is, although the Sefer HaChinuch says it, so who am I to argue? In a sense, it's a weak reason, because if the purpose of the freedom is the Torah is not another holiday. This is the purpose. And in fact, of the 4 terms of redemption, of the 4 cups, the 4th cup, Lakachli, I will take you on to be for a nation, is actually referring to Matan Torah. The Dalit Kossos themselves is referring to Matan Torah. So here, so we're back to square one. What is the concept of deferring Sfira to day 2? So let me share with you something that Rav Nachman of Breslov says in the Likutei Maran. And he actually says it in the name of his great-grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov. So this actually goes back to the Baal Shem Tov himself, which has nothing to do with Shavuos, nothing to do with, but it's a general observation that I think will be a very powerful answer to this question. He raises the question, which indeed might bother many people. When you first come to Judaism, let's say you're a Choser B'Tshuva, and you come to Judaism, everything seems very bright. You see excitement, you see passion, you see sweetness. Every Shabbos is a wonderful experience. Every davening you feel so close to God. Learning is wonderful. In fact, this is the old joke. I mean, there are a lot of jokes of this genre which are a little sad, but they happen to be true. That is, how do you tell if somebody's a Baal Tshuva or from birth? It says, okay, if you're crying during davening, you're a Baal Tshuva for sure. You know, if you take more than 3 minutes to bench, you're a Baal Tshuva for sure. You know, the basic idea is people who have passion in what they do, they must be Baal Tshuva. Like there was a classic speech. This is a very, very funny speech about a man who was honored at Lincoln Square dinner for his work with Kiruv B'Chaikim, and he called his speech "Why I Hate Baal Tshuva." It was actually a very affectionate speech. But he said, you know, I come home Friday night, all I want to do is get through the meal in 15 minutes and go to sleep. And we're about to bench, and I'm ready, Baruch Hashem, ready to bench. I'm going to hit the bed in 2 minutes. And this Baal Tshuva says, hey, you didn't say a Dvar Torah in the Parsha. Just, wow. You didn't sing all the Zemiras here. You know, so that's why I hate Baal Tshuva, because they make me do all these things. So the question is this, what's going on? How come when I first come to Torah, it is so beautiful and exciting, and then afterwards, with the decades, I lose my geschmack? Now, the simple answer you're going to give me isn't going to work. I mean, the simple answer obviously is habituation. Listen, the more I do something over and over and over again, it loses its impact. But the truth is, that doesn't really make sense with mitzvahs. Because if every mitzvah deepens your connection with Hashem, how could there be diminishing returns? How could it be that the more I learn and the more I do, the less I feel? You can't just offer habituation as the answer to this, because this is a spiritual reality. A kesher to Hashem. Right? I can look at a beginner and I can be so envious of the love that they bring to tefillah. Why can't I have that? This is the Baal Shem Tov raised the question. So here's what the Baal Shem Tov said. Rav Nachman quotes the Baal Shem Tov. Let's imagine a baby that's learning to walk. So first of all, the process, those of you who have children, the process of children learning to walk actually is a wondrous, wondrous process. Even crawling. I remember to this day, my son, who is now almost 40, I remember when he started crawling, forget about walking, crawling. And it was so hard. He was really in like pain. He was usually like grunting. And I'm thinking to myself, why are you working so hard? Stay in the crib and play. What is making you go on like this? Why are you doing it? You're obviously not comfortable. This is an amazing thing. Hashem hardwired the human to want to achieve, to want to learn, to want to grow, to keep on moving and not get discouraged. And no matter how, and learning to walk is the same thing. No matter how many times the kid is going to fall down, he's going to get up again. Defeat is actually not part of the natural human condition. The natural human condition is hope, is optimism, of going on. Yeah, we do learn defeat, even as young, or we may pick it up even as young children. But that's a learned response. That's not the nature. And by the way, happiness is the same thing. People ask the question, it's a good question, why are kids happy? Kids are generally happy. Like, why? Why are kids happy? And part of the answer is because that is the natural way we are. We can become unhappy because of experiences and disappointments and the like. Now, you don't need a reason why kids are happy. You actually need reasons why we're unhappy. The natural condition of a human being is happiness. The natural condition of a human being is resilience, not giving up. So children learning to walk is quite an amazing thing. But that's a little digression from the Baal Shem Tov's point. The Baal Shem Tov's point is, when the kid begins to walk, so he's unsteady, so the parents are holding on to his shoulders, holding on to his arms, and he takes a step, then another step, and another step. And then at some point, the parents feel the child is ready to do it on his own. They let go. They're still there, of course, to protect him. And as soon as they let go, what is likely to happen is plop, plop, plop. He's going to fall. Now, of course, he'll get up again, that's true, but he's going to fall. So if the child could verbalize his or her thoughts, the child might wonder, how come it was so easy a minute ago, and now it's gotten hard? Have I regressed? Only 2.5 years or whatever it is. I'm regressing already. What's going on? Am I losing it? And the answer is no, you haven't regressed. Until now, you were being held up by Abba and Ima. Now you have to make it your own. Now you have to learn on your own how to do it. And that's going to involve failing, and involve falling and the like. So says the Baal Shem Tov, Gavaldik, says the Baal Shem Tov, when a person is very far from God, they haven't yet embraced a full life of Torah. God carries them to artificially high levels. God carries you. When He carries you, this looks beautiful, and that looks beautiful, and that looks great. And at some point, Hashem says, I've shown you what you're able to become. Now I'm going to put you down. Now I'm going to let go. And I've shown you what a life of Torah is. Now it's your job to internalize it and make it your own. So counterintuitively, Rav Nachman develops this. When a person faces obstacles in their avodas Hashem, it is not a sign of failure. It is not a sign of losing a level. It is actually a sign of divine confidence that they're ready for the next step of internalizing what Hashem had shown them artificially. You see? Because ultimately, the only thing that matters is not the artificial highs that God gives you, but the achievements of struggle in which slowly but surely you climb the mountain. This is Rav Nachman, and again, this is not referring specifically to Shavuos, but interestingly enough, Rav Shneur Zalman, the Baal HaTanya, applies a very similar thought without using the Baal Shem Tov's mashal to the relationship between Pesach and Shavuos. Pesach, similar to what we said from the Meshech Chochmah, represents a sudden, intense revelation of godliness that was truly beyond our capacity. Remember, we are in the 49th level of impurity. Had we stayed even another few minutes, the time that it takes for dough to rise, we would have been gone. We should have been there longer, but we had to be taken out early. 4/5 of the Jewish people died. The 1/5 were considered to be naked of mitzvahs. They were idol worshippers. They didn't practice Brit Milah, except for Shevet Levi. And Hashem had to give us the mitzvah of circumcision and the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. So we would have some zechus to leave. So we were in a very, very undeserving state. That's why the Torah describes over and over again. We left Mitzrayim b'chipazon. We left Mitzrayim in a hurry. When we leave in a hurry, what does that mean? You're not ready for the trip. But you gotta go now. And yet, Chazal say, at the Red Sea, the lowliest maidservant saw greater holiness, a greater revelation of godliness than even the prophet Yechezkel, who was zocheh to see the divine throne of God. So Pesach represents the artificial high of the person who receives gifts from God beyond their capacity. But God shows them a great light. But then comes the Omer, in which Hashem takes us off that high, puts us on the ground, and says, I've shown you what you're capable of becoming. Now, become it. Make it your own. I'm letting go a little bit. And just as father and mother are still there to protect us, God is always there. But He wants us to become independent. And that's the difference. Pesach is sudden revelation. Shavuos is a gradual, incremental process. The Omer, every day there's a special midah that we work on. Last week we talked about the spheros, the emanations. There's a special midah that we work on because sudden revelation just comes to you all at once. But this internal spiritual growth comes through a gradual process of avodah. And that is why the counting of the Omer is the day after Shabbos. Because it's the next day. It's the next step. It's a new agenda. It's a new approach. It is no longer the spirituality that is handed to you. It is the spirituality that you earn through work and through effort. Mimacharas, a new day, a new beginning, a new approach. To recognize that we struggle and we work on ourselves in all of the different ways, and sometimes spiritual progress is not going to be a straight upward trajectory. Sometimes it'll be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and sometimes it may even be 1 step forward and 2 steps back. But you keep going. You don't give up. You persevere. There's a t-shirt saying, which although it's not of Jewish origin, but like a lot of t-shirt sayings, it expresses Jewish truths, that what you are is God's gift to you. What you do with what you are is your gift back to God. Pesach shows me what I am, or at least what I could be. Sphira and Shavuos is the internalization of making that process your own. And that's why it's graduated, it's gradual, and that's why it is mimacharas HaShabbos. And indeed, this actually explains, based on the Meshech Chochmah, why it uses Shabbos, because Shabbos represents the gift that we didn't earn. So that's what you're saying. Mimacharas Sphira is the day after, the next level. In other words, it's very meduyak why it has to use Shabbos, because that's the whole point. Shabbos is what God gives you. You didn't earn it. So the Baal HaTanya then concludes with a very, very beautiful passage from the Zohar, interpreting a verse in Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim is a book of the Tanakh, of course. It's one of the 5 Megillos. And according to both the book itself and Chazal's Masorah, Shir HaShirim was written by Shlomo HaMelech. And, Shir HaShirim almost didn't make it. Shir HaShirim was banned in Boston, as they say, because Shir HaShirim is frankly an erotic book. It describes a passionate relationship of a man and a woman. And if you read Shir HaShirim although it's still in very good taste, by the way, Chas v'Shalom, one shouldn't compare it to, even if you read Shir HaShirim in the most literal way, it actually is a very sweet book. It's not a coarse book at all, but it is somewhat explicit. And therefore, there were sages who felt that Shir HaShirim did not belong in the Tanakh. So who is the great redeemer of Shir HaShirim? Who got it in? None other than Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, so that's pretty late, actually. So Rabbi Akiva made the argument to the Chachamim that if all of the songs in the Tanakh are holy, Shir HaShirim is the holiest of the holy, because it is a metaphor, it is an allegory for the love that God has for the Jewish people, and the Jewish people have for God, and all of the references to the shepherd are really Hashem, that is our shepherd and protector, and the references of the woman that is yearning to be with the shepherd is a reference to the Jewish people yearning to be with God. And this is the standard mahalach that is taken in the Midrashim of Shir HaShirim, which are a huge amount of Midrashim, and in Rashi's commentary. And there are actually other mahalachim, but the most common, widespread learning of Shir HaShirim is that we look at it as a love story between the Jewish people and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem is the male character in the book, and the Jewish people are the female character in the book. In fact, this can explain all sorts of psukim. Now, there's a scene in Shir HaShirim where the woman has gone to sleep and her beloved is knocking at the door, and she says, Kol dodi dofek, the voice of my beloved is knocking at the door, and I say, I'm asleep already, don't wake me up. Again, the Chazal say that's referring to the Mashiach. Hashem is waiting to redeem us, knocking at the door. And we're not interested at that point. Right? So there's a lot of pathos in all of that. So, in the very beginning of the book, the woman cries out to her beloved, who's not there, or not visible, and says, Moshcheni acharecha, pull me after you, narutza, so we can run together. It's a pasuk, Moshcheni acharecha, narutza. So the Zohar says the following: Moshcheni acharecha refers to Pesach. Narutza, so we can run together, refer to Shavuos. This is the Zohar. So the Baal HaTanya says, this is exactly the pshat. When I pull you, that means you're like a sack of potatoes. You're really passive. But I come and I pull you. So with Pesach, it's Moshcheni. We're not really ready for redemption, but God is pulling us out because we have to get out of there. But eventually, we get strong enough that we run with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're no longer being pulled. We've internalized the Madrega. So we are with Hashem. We are walking, we're running with Hashem. So that's exactly the transition here. Moshcheni acharecha is Pesach, narutza, and therefore Shavuos. Through the process of the Omer, we run with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There are many stories about the Vilna Gaon, that the Vilna Gaon, whose greatness in Torah was beyond any type of understanding, that angels would come to him to offer him all sorts of interpretations of things, the secrets of the Torah. And he turned them down. He says, I don't want gifts. I don't want freebies. I only want the Torah that I achieve through my work, through my effort, through my yagia. He turned things down. In fact, they have other stories sometimes where they say that It's unbelievable that sometimes, as you would expect, it's very, very hard. Thoughts would come to him in davening. Torah thoughts would come to him in davening. So something like on one pasuk in the middle of davening, like 150 explanations of a pasuk came to him. 150 pshatim based on Zohar, based on Kabbalah, and he was mispalel that he should forget them because he considered them to be treif, no good. They came to the middle of davening. You're supposed to focus on davening. You don't focus on even Torah. And he forgot all of them, and then he tried to regain them afterwards. And he worked very, very hard. And Baruch Hashem, the story goes, they came back to him. But that was the idea. He didn't want things that were freebies. He didn't want things that came to him during tefillah, etc. Everything had to be based on his own Yigia B'Torah. And in truth, obviously those are not our levels in any way at all. But in truth, we have to recognize that even in our own lives, these significant accomplishments are what we've done with what Hashem gave us. Right? We don't deserve credit for what we are naturally. That's a gift of Hashem. But what we do with our kochos, what we do with our abilities, that's the gift we give back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is just a concluding thought of the period of the counting of the Omer. And B'ezras Hashem, may God help us to keep on walking, to climb that mountain, not to get discouraged, to learn from young children who learn to walk and learn to crawl, that no matter how many times you fall, you keep on going. And that is the natural condition. It's funny. We have to talk about working on ourselves to do that. Yeah, it's true, because we're so conditioned to giving up. But in reality, it's not even a matter of working. It's simply a matter of, this is how Hashem made us. And we just have to try to recapture what Hashem put into our natures, of not giving up, of being optimistic, of being hopeful, of being happy, of appreciating life. And then, no matter how many times we sometimes are not successful, keep on going. Don't give up. I think last week I mentioned that after Rabbi Akiva lost the 24,000 students, he went back to have 5 students. And you might think, again, just repeating myself, what's the point of having 5 students? You lost 24,000. And yet from those 5 students and their successors came the Mishnah, came the Gemara, came all of the Torah Shebaal Peh, came the Rashi, came the Tosfos. Yeah, from 5 students can come everything. So we have to also recognize that on every level, what we do matters, what we do counts. And if what we do counts, we have to make it count. What do they say by Sphira? They say, count every day and make every day count, right? That's a common, it's a buzz phrase they use for Sphira. So, no, once again, it happens to be true. So, wish you all well, and maybe be zochet to a Kabbalah Satorah B'Yaba.